Under the light of a blood-red moon, a chilling howl reverberated through the dense woods of Black Hollow, a sound that sent shivers down the spine of anyone within earshot. But this was no ordinary wolf. It was a beast, neither fully alive nor entirely dead, cursed to hunt endlessly. The villagers whispered of its presence, warning travelers not to wander after dark. Those who ignored the warning didn't just disappear, they became part of the howl, forever. Black Hollow was a forgotten village, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. The villagers lived simple lives, bound by a set of unwritten rules. No one entered the woods after sunset, no matter what they heard or saw. These rules weren't just folklore, they were survival tactics. The elders spoke of a time, generations ago, when a hunter had angered the spirits of the forest by killing an entire wolf pack in a single night. Legend had it that the Alpha, a massive black wolf with fiery red eyes, had returned from the dead, cursed to haunt the woods and avenge its pack. The howls began years later, on a moonlit night. At first, they were distant, mournful cries. But as the years went by, the howls grew closer, louder, and more menacing. Villagers who ventured into the woods never returned, and those foolish enough to stay out late were found mutilated, their faces frozen in expressions of sheer terror. Martha, a young wildlife photographer, arrived in Black Hollow on a crisp autumn afternoon. She was known for her boldness, often venturing into dangerous terrain for the perfect shot. When she overheard the villagers talking about the Silent Howl, she dismissed their warnings as superstitious ramblings. A wolf cursed by spirits? Sounds like a perfect story to go viral, she joked. Martha prepared her gear that evening, packing her camera, a sturdy flashlight, and a small knife. The villagers pleaded with her not to go, but she brushed them off. I've handled bears, mountain lions, and storms. A wolf howl won't scare me, she said with a smirk. As she entered the forest, the temperature dropped sharply. The trees, tall and ancient, stood like silent sentinels, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes against the darkening sky. The ground was damp, covered in a thick layer of leaves that muffled her footsteps. The first howl pierced the air, distant but bone-chilling. Martha froze, her heart pounding. She shook it off and continued walking, but the howl came again, closer this time. Her flashlight flickered. She smacked it, cursing under her breath, but the flickering grew worse until the light went out entirely. She switched to her backup flashlight, its weak beam barely illuminating the path ahead. The forest seemed alive. Shadows danced between the trees, and the sound of rustling leaves surrounded her. She tried to reassure herself that it was just the wind, but then she noticed something strange. Paw prints. Massive paw prints. They appeared fresh, as if the creature was only moments ahead of her. As Martha followed the prints, she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center lay a pile of bones, bleached white and glistening under the moonlight. She bent down to examine them, realizing they weren't just animal bones. Among them were human skulls, cracked and gnawed. The howl came again, this time so loud and close that it rattled her bones. She spun around, shining her flashlight into the trees. And then she saw it. Glowing red eyes stared at her from the shadows, unblinking. The creature stepped into the clearing, and Martha's breath caught in her throat. It was massive, its fur matted with blood and its teeth unnaturally sharp. Its jaw hung open, revealing rows of jagged teeth that dripped with saliva. The wolf didn't attack immediately. Instead, it circled her, its eyes locked onto hers. She could feel its hatred, its hunger. Then it spoke. Martha, it growled, its voice low and guttural. The sound was impossible, inhuman. You think you can capture me? She dropped her flashlight in terror, but before she could run, the wolf lunged. It pinned her to the ground, its claws sinking into her shoulders. But instead of killing her, it leaned in, its foul breath hot against her face. You will remember me, it whispered. And so will they. Martha woke up hours later, alone in the clearing. Her gear was gone, her flashlight shattered. She staggered back to the village, her clothes torn and bloodied. The villagers gasped when they saw her. You shouldn't be alive, one of the elders said, his voice trembling. It mocked you. That night, the howling began again, louder than ever. But this time, it wasn't just the wolf's voice. Mixed in with the howls was Martha's scream, echoing through the forest. She tried to leave the village, but the wolf followed her. Every night, it appeared outside her window, its red eyes glowing in the dark. Her nightmares grew worse, filled with images of the wolf and the clearing. Within a week, Martha was found dead in her cabin, her body mangled as if by claws. The walls were covered in bloody paw prints, and her final scream was carved into the wood. The villagers buried Martha, but her voice never left. The howls grew louder, more agonized, and more frequent. Travelers who heard them claimed to hear a woman's scream mixed with the wolf's cry. Over time, the Silent Howl became a curse for anyone who stayed too long in Black Hollow. And now they say if you listen closely on a moonlit night, you can hear not one but two voices in the howls, both calling your name. Deep in the heart of a rundown zoo stood an old cage, rusted and forgotten, covered in vines and cobwebs. Locals claimed no one had dared to enter the cage since the accident, a zookeeper mauled to death under bizarre circumstances. The eerie silence around the cage became a chilling warning to visitors. But when a group of friends ignored the warnings, what they unleashed would not only haunt them but anyone who dared to look into the cage's history. The Willow Creek Zoo had seen better days. Once a thriving tourist attraction, it had fallen into disrepair, with faded signs, peeling paint, and enclosures overgrown with weeds. The animals seemed more like prisoners than attractions, their listless eyes reflecting the sorrow of their confinement. Among the dilapidated exhibits was one enclosure that stood out, a cage covered in rust and hidden behind a faded tarp. Visitors often asked about it, but the zookeepers would only shake their heads, muttering vague warnings. It's better left alone. Local legends swirled around the cage, fueled by the mysterious death of a zookeeper named Harold decades ago. They said he'd been dragged into the cage by a massive animal that no one could identify. When his body was found, it was torn apart, his face frozen in a scream of terror. The animal was never recovered. Sophie, Mark, and Jason were thrill-seekers, always on the lookout for their next adventure. When they heard about the mysterious cage, they couldn't resist. Sophie, the boldest of the group, suggested sneaking into the zoo after hours. "Think about it," she said, her eyes gleaming. "If we capture something weird, we'll go viral." Despite Jason's reluctance, the trio climbed over the zoo's fence one cold, moonless night. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the faint rustling of leaves added to the eerie silence. As they made their way through the dark pathways, their flashlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. When they reached the cage, Sophie tore off the tarp, revealing rusted bars and a broken lock. Inside, the ground was littered with bones, animal and human. A nauseating stench wafted out, making Jason gag. "This doesn't feel right," Jason whispered, backing away. But Sophie was already stepping into the cage, her flashlight sweeping across the interior. "It's just an old cage," she said, her voice echoing. The air inside the cage was unnaturally cold, and Sophie felt a sudden pressure on her chest, as if the atmosphere was closing in. She tried to speak, but found her throat constricted. Mark, standing at the entrance, noticed Sophie's pale face and reached out to pull her back. That's when the growl came. The sound was low and guttural, vibrating through their bones. Jason's flashlight flickered wildly, and Mark stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. From the shadows of the cage, two glowing eyes appeared, bright and malevolent. "What is that?" Mark stammered, pulling Sophie out of the cage. The creature stepped into the dim light. It resembled a panther but was grotesquely deformed, its body covered in patches of matted fur and exposed muscle. Its mouth was unnaturally wide, filled with jagged teeth, and its claws scraped against the metal floor, sending sparks flying. Jason screamed, dropping his flashlight, and the beast lunged. Its claws swiped through the air, narrowly missing him. The group ran, their screams echoing through the empty zoo. The creature didn't stay in the cage. It burst out, moving with terrifying speed, its growls turning into a deafening roar. As they ran, the zoo seemed to transform. Paths twisted and stretched, leading them in circles. Shadows darted between the trees, and the cries of unseen animals filled the air. Sophie tripped over a root, and the creature pounced. Mark swung his flashlight at it, the beam briefly illuminating its monstrous face. It recoiled, but only for a moment. "Go! Go!" Mark shouted, helping Sophie to her feet. The trio burst into the reptile house, slamming the door behind them. The building was silent, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. As they caught their breath, they realized the creature was no longer outside. It was inside, lurking in the shadows. Jason spotted movement near the alligator tank. The creature's reflection glinted in the water, its eyes locked onto them. It leapt, smashing through the glass, sending shards flying. Sophie screamed as it pinned Jason, its claws tearing into his chest. Mark grabbed a fire extinguisher and swung it with all his strength, striking the creature's head. It howled in pain, momentarily stunned, and Jason crawled away, gasping for air. "We have to trap it," Sophie said, her voice shaking. They lured the creature into the storage room, slamming the door shut and barricading it with metal shelves. The beast roared, shaking the walls, but the door held. Or so they thought. As they stumbled back toward the zoo's entrance, thinking they'd escaped, the growling returned, this time closer. The creature had found another way out. It attacked with unmatched fury, dragging Mark into the darkness. His screams were cut short, replaced by the sickening sound of tearing flesh. Sophie and Jason ran, but the creature was relentless. It leapt onto Jason, crushing his skull with a single bite. Sophie made it to the gate, her hands trembling as she tried to climb. Just as she reached the top, the creature grabbed her leg, pulling her back down. She fought desperately, but its claws tore through her, leaving her lifeless body sprawled at the zoo's entrance. The next morning, their bodies were discovered by the zookeepers, mangled and unrecognizable. The cursed cage was sealed once again, but the creature was never found. Now visitors claim to hear growls near the cage at night, and some even say they've seen glowing eyes watching them from the shadows. But no one dares to enter the cage, because those who do never come back. Deep within the misty forests of Black Hollow, there lies a forbidden path, shrouded by gnarled trees and shadows that move when no one is watching. Locals whisper of strange howls at night, a chilling melody that lures travelers into the woods, never to return. It is said that the wolves there aren't just animals but creatures cursed to guard a secret older than the forest itself. When a group of hikers ignored the warnings, the whispers began. What followed was a nightmare of teeth, blood, and voices that would haunt their souls forever. Black Hollow Forest was notorious for its eerie reputation. Signs at every entry point warned visitors to stay on the marked trails. But for Clara, an avid hiker, the forbidden path was irresistible. She convinced her 3 friends, Ethan, Laura, and Sam, to join her, promising a route filled with breathtaking views and the thrill of exploring the unknown. "I heard it's just a legend," Clara said confidently, tightening her backpack straps. Laura hesitated. "What about the stories? The people who disappeared?" Ethan scoffed. "Probably just wolves. Stick together, and we'll be fine." As they ventured deeper into the forest, the sunlight grew faint, filtered through the dense canopy of ancient trees. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, like the scent of rust. Laura couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every crackle of leaves underfoot made her jump. By late afternoon, they reached a clearing with an unsettling silence. No birds sang, and the usual rustling of wildlife was absent. Ethan checked his map, frowning. "This doesn't make sense. We should have hit the ridge by now." Then they heard it, a soft whisper carried by the wind. "Go back." The voice was faint, almost melodic, but distinctly human. Clara froze, her eyes darting around the trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Laura clutched Ethan's arm. "Someone's messing with us." Sam, the skeptic of the group, laughed nervously. Probably just the wind. But as the whispers grew louder, they became impossible to ignore. The words were fragmented, overlapping, like multiple voices speaking in unison. Leave, not safe, they're coming. As dusk fell, the group stumbled upon a strange symbol carved into the ground, a circle surrounded by claw marks. Clara knelt to examine it, her flashlight flickering. It looks ancient, she murmured, tracing the grooves with her fingers. The howling began. Low and mournful, it echoed through the forest, coming from all directions. Ethan shone his flashlight into the trees, catching a glimpse of glowing yellow eyes. Wolves, he said, his voice barely a whisper. But these weren't ordinary wolves. As they stepped into the light, their forms became clearer. Their fur was mangy, their bodies unnaturally large, with elongated snouts and razor-sharp teeth. Their eyes glowed with an intelligence that sent chills down the group's spines. "They're too big," Laura whispered, backing away. One of the wolves let out a bone-chilling growl, and the group scattered, running in different directions. Clara and Laura sprinted together, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in around them, twisting and warping as if to block their escape. Behind them, the wolves were relentless, their growls growing louder with every step. Clara tripped over a root and fell hard, her flashlight skidding into the darkness. As she scrambled to her feet, one of the wolves lunged, its jaws snapping shut inches from her arm. Laura grabbed a branch and swung it with all her strength, striking the wolf's snout. It howled in rage but didn't retreat. Meanwhile, Ethan and Sam weren't faring any better. They had climbed a steep embankment, but the wolves followed, their claws digging into the dirt. Sam threw his water bottle at one of them, the plastic bouncing harmlessly off its head. "We can't outrun them," Sam shouted. Ethan spotted a cave in the distance. "There. Go." The group reunited at the entrance of the cave, panting and terrified. The howling had stopped, but the silence was even more unnerving. "We need to keep moving," Clara said, her voice shaking. Inside, the cave walls were etched with more of the strange symbols they'd seen earlier. The air was damp and cold, and the whispers returned, louder and clearer. "They see you. They smell your fear. You'll never leave." As they ventured deeper, the cave opened into a massive chamber. At its center was a stone altar covered in dried blood and surrounded by piles of bones. Some were unmistakably human. "Oh my God," Laura whispered, covering her mouth. Before they could react, the wolves appeared at the entrance, blocking their escape. But they didn't attack. Instead, they began to change. The wolves' bodies contorted, their bones snapping and reshaping. Their fur receded, revealing pale, mottled skin. Within moments, they had transformed into grotesque humanoid creatures with elongated limbs, clawed hands, and faces that were a horrific blend of human and wolf. One of them stepped forward, its voice a guttural growl. "You were warned." The group froze, paralyzed by terror. The creatures surrounded them, their whispers turning into chants. The air grew heavy, and the chamber began to vibrate. "What do you want?" Clara screamed. The creature grinned, its sharp teeth glinting. "You." The creatures attacked with terrifying speed. Laura was the first to fall, her screams echoing as claws tore into her flesh. Ethan tried to fight back, swinging his flashlight, but it was useless. One of the creatures grabbed him by the neck, snapping it with a sickening crack. Sam and Clara ran deeper into the cave, but there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in, and the whispers grew deafening. Sam tripped and was dragged away, his cries fading into the darkness. Clara stumbled into a smaller chamber, where a massive stone wolf statue loomed. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, as the creatures surrounded her. The last thing she saw was the statue's eyes glowing, and the creatures lunging toward her. The next morning, hikers found their abandoned gear at the forest's edge, but there was no sign of the group. Locals say the wolves' howls have grown louder since that night, and the whispers can now be heard even during the day.